Imagine finding out your parents have a secret, fully funded investment account for your sister's college. But when you ask about yours, they scream that it's none of your business because you're adopted. That is the heartbreaking reality for one guy in our first story. And honestly, it's brutal. But stick around because it gets weirder. We've also got a woman convinced that eating Thanksgiving stuffing will turn her into a literal zombie from The Last of Us, and a homophobic sister who got absolutely destroyed by her own logic. Hey, what's up, guys? Welcome back to AITA Chronicles, where we break down the wildest Reddit AITA stories every single day. If you love drama, tough moral dilemmas, and some seriously messy situations, you're in the right place. Our goal, 10K subscribers, and every single one of you watching helps us get there. So hit that like button, subscribe, and let's jump right into today's chaos. Am I the asshole for asking my adoptive parents if they have a college fund for me, like they have for my sister? Okay, so before we even get into this absolute dumpster fire of a situation, can we just acknowledge how heartbreaking it is that this kid even has to ask if he's the asshole here? Like the bar is literally in hell. But all right, let's dive into this mess because honestly, I need you all to hear this story. So our writer is 17, male, and was adopted as an infant. Right off the bat, we're talking about someone who's only ever known one family. These are the only parents he's ever had. This is the only home he's ever known. Keep that in mind because it's going to make everything that comes next hurt even more. His parents were in their late 30s and had been trying to have biological kids for over a decade with no success. So they went the adoption route. And honestly, the beginning sounds almost like a Hallmark movie. His adoptive mom was literally in the delivery room holding his birth mom's hand when he was born. That's intimate, that's beautiful, that's the kind of origin story that should end with, and they loved him more than anything in the world. Spoiler alert, that's not where this is heading, and I'm already stressed. Then 3 years later, plot twist. Mom gets pregnant with his now 14-year-old sister, and look, getting pregnant after adopting is actually pretty common. Sometimes the stress of trying to conceive is what prevents it. So once people relax after adopting, boom, pregnancy happens. That's not the problem here. The problem is what comes next. And oh boy, is it a problem. Writer drops this absolutely devastating line. He doesn't know if they treated him differently after his sister was born, or if they were always a little less in love with me than some adopted kids get. Can we just sit with that for a second? This kid is out here wondering if his parents were ever fully in love with him. He's comparing his experience to other adopted kids and realizing he got the short end of the stick. That's not a normal thing a child should have to think about. And he says he always felt that his sister was the clear favorite and their real child. Always. This isn't some recent development. This has been his entire childhood experience. Then he starts listing all the ways they show favoritism, and honestly, it's painful to read. His parents adore his sister. They spoil her. She gets cute nicknames like Little Sweetheart and Baby Star. And I'm going to take a wild guess that our writer, yeah, he probably doesn't get called Little Sweetheart. He probably gets called by his regular name like he's the neighbor kid and not their actual son. But wait, it gets worse. They're obsessed with how their daughter looks like the perfect mix of both of them. Mom's eyes and nose, dad's hair color and round face. They're out here doing a whole ancestry DNA breakdown about their kid in front of their other kid who obviously doesn't share their genetics. Like imagine sitting at the dinner table while your parents go on and on about how your sister is the perfect genetic blend of both of them and you're just sitting there like, yeah, cool. Anyway, I exist too. The lack of awareness is actually stunning. And then, because apparently this family wasn't toxic enough yet, his cousins used to tell him that his parents had their real kid now, and if they could send him back, they would. These are children telling another child that he's basically a returned Amazon package waiting to happen. And the absolute kicker, the family knew this was happening, and nobody cared. Not one adult stepped in and said, hey, maybe we shouldn't let the kids psychologically torture the adopted one. They all just let it happen. What kind of family does that? Now we get into the specific differences in treatment, and it's like reading a checklist of emotional neglect. No cuddles and kisses like sister gets. No quality time with each parent individually like she gets. Doesn't get spoiled like her. And before anyone says, well, maybe he's exaggerating, he straight up says they didn't completely ignore him and he did get gifts, but they spent less money on him and bought less for him overall. They've got actual different budgets for their two kids and think that's normal behavior. Ryder even tries to rationalize it. He's like, maybe it's because I'm a guy and she's a girl. No, babe. That's not it. That's not it at all. But this is what happens when you grow up in this situation. You start making excuses for the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally because accepting the truth is too painful. And here's what really gets me. He told them about this multiple times. He communicated his feelings like we're always told to do, right? Use your words, express your emotions, tell people how you feel. And what happened? They said, oh, and moved on. Didn't change anything. Didn't even acknowledge whether it was true or not. Just, oh, and subject change. They basically told him his feelings don't matter enough to even discuss. That's not parenting. That's just existing in the same house as a child you're legally responsible for. His sister is out here being absolutely vicious too, telling him she wishes she had a real sibling instead of a fake one, saying their cousins are her real family and he's not. She's 14, not 4. She knows exactly how cruel she's being, and you know the parents aren't correcting this behavior because they're basically modeling it themselves. All right, now we get to the part that really pushed this whole situation over the edge. A year ago, when he was 16, he overhears his parents talking to his aunt about this huge college fund for his sister. Not just like a small savings account. They're talking about investments, taking money from their savings, really going all in on securing her financial future. And they never once mentioned having one for him. So now he's at school, and people are asking the normal questions like, are your parents helping with college? And he has to awkwardly say he doesn't think so and start researching financial aid. Meanwhile, his younger sister apparently has her entire college education funded and locked down. Do you understand how this is going to affect his entire future? She gets to graduate debt-free, start her career without loans hanging over her head, maybe buy a house earlier, all of that. He's going to be scraping together financial aid and probably taking out loans that'll follow him for decades. They're literally setting up two completely different life trajectories for their kids. But wait, there's more pain. A few months ago, he reaches out to his birth parents and, like, of course he did, right? He's clearly searching for someone, anyone, who might actually want him and care about him. And his birth parents said no. They don't want a relationship. That's a rejection that would break most adults, let alone a teenage kid who's already feeling unwanted by his adoptive family. His adoptive parents expected as much, but didn't think to warn him or prepare him for that rejection. They just let him reach out and get shot down and then offered zero comfort afterward. No hug, no, we're sorry that happened, no, you're our son and we love you, just nothing. Radio silence. And then his sister, because apparently she's competing for the Worst Human Being award, tells him he has 4 parents who don't want him, so he must be broken. I I don't even have words. That is one of the cruelest things I've ever heard one sibling say to another. And you know the parents didn't punish her for that because if they actually cared, she wouldn't feel comfortable saying something that vile in the first place. 2 weeks ago, very recently, his parents literally told him to tell his guidance counselor that they're too busy and she should just talk to him about college stuff instead of them. They're actively trying to opt out of being involved in his college planning. Like, they can't even be bothered to have a single conversation with his counselor about his future. That's some next level uninvolved parenting right there. Ryder puts 2 and 2 together. The counselor probably wanted to discuss finances, which is why they're dodging her. So he finally asked the question directly. Do you have a college fund for me like you have for my sister? It's a completely reasonable question. He's 17 years old, about to apply to colleges. He has every right to know what financial support he might have available. This is literally just asking for basic information about his own future. And how do they respond? They get mad at him. Instead of answering the question, instead of reassuring him, they ask how he found out about the sister's fund and get angry at him for asking. First of all, asking, "How did you know about it?" is basically confirming that yes, the sister has one. Second, getting angry at your kid for asking about their own college funding is absolutely wild. He points out the very logical fact that he's going to college before his sister. He's 17, she's 14. So, if anything, wouldn't you set up his fund first? And their response is to tell him it's none of his business. I'm sorry, but how is your own college fund none of your business? How is your own financial future and education planning none of your business? Make it make sense. It doesn't, because they know they're wrong and they're getting defensive about it. So now the house is tense, shocker, and his sister is actively rubbing it in his face that she gets a college fund and he doesn't, because of course she is. She's learned from watching her parents that it's totally fine to treat him as less than, so why would she stop now? And they still haven't actually confirmed or denied whether he has a fund. But yeah, not saying anything is absolutely an answer. If he had one, they would have just said, "Yes, you have one too. Don't worry." The fact that they got defensive and angry and refused to answer tells you everything you need to know. The silence is the answer. So let me be absolutely crystal clear here. No, writer, you are not the asshole. You are so far from being the asshole that I can't even see it from where you're standing. You asked a completely legitimate, reasonable, important question about your own future and your own education. You're about to become an adult. You're planning for college. You have every right to know what financial resources you have available to you. That's not being entitled. That's being practical and responsible. That's literally what any guidance counselor would tell you to do. Figure out your financial situation so you can make informed decisions about where to apply and how to pay for it. Your parents, though, they're failing you spectacularly, like Olympic level failing, gold medal in bad parenting. When you adopt a child, that child is your child. Full stop. Period. End of story. They don't get to treat you like a placeholder until they got their real biological kid. That's not how adoption works. That's not how parenting works. That's not how being a decent human being works. Everything you've described, the difference in affection, the nicknames only for her, the obsession with her genetics, allowing your cousins to torment you, your sister being cruel to you with no consequences, spending less money on you, not giving you quality time, dismissing your feelings when you spoke up, offering no comfort when your birth parents rejected you, avoiding your college planning, and apparently not setting up a college fund after your sister has one. All of that is a pattern of favoritism and neglect that's honestly heartbreaking to read. Uh, the college fund thing isn't just about money, and I think you know that. It's about what it represents. It says, "We're invested in your future. We want you to succeed. We're planning ahead for you. You matter to us." By giving your sister a fund and not you, they're saying her future matters more than yours. They're setting her up to start adult life with opportunities and freedom while you're going to be scrambling for financial aid and probably drowning in student loans. That's going to affect everything: where you can afford to go to school, what you can study, your ability to take internships that don't pay well, when you can afford to buy a car or a house, all of it. This isn't a small thing. This is potentially life altering. You deserve better than this. You deserved parents who lit up when you walked in the room. You deserve to be spoiled and cuddled and given cute nicknames. You deserve to never question whether you were loved or wanted. You deserve to be protected from your cruel cousins and your cruel sister. You deserved parents who would have shut down that fake sibling garbage immediately. You deserve to have your feelings acknowledged and validated when you spoke up about feeling left out. You deserved comfort when your birth parents rejected you. That should have been a moment where your adoptive parents stepped up and reminded you that you are their son and they love you. You deserve to have parents excited about your college plans. And you absolutely deserve to have a college fund, or at the very least, an honest conversation about finances. You're not broken, like your horrible sister said. You're not less than because you're adopted. You're not wrong for asking a simple question about college funding. You're a kid who got dealt an incredibly unfair hand, by people who were supposed to love you unconditionally, and none of that is your fault. None of it. Not the asshole. Not even close. Your parents are, though. Massively. And honestly, I hope you get out of that house, find your people who actually appreciate you for who you are, build an amazing life, and leave these people in the dust where they belong. You've got one more year until you're 18 and can start fresh. And I'm genuinely rooting for you to absolutely thrive once you're free from this toxicity. And real talk, start looking into every scholarship, grant, and financial aid option available. Talk to your guidance counselor honestly about your situation. You don't have to go into all the emotional stuff. Just be clear that your parents aren't contributing to your education. There are resources as out there for students in your situation. You can do this without them, and you're going to be stronger for it, even though you shouldn't have to be. Am I the asshole for laughing about a pretend allergy? All right, buckle up because this one is wild and it takes a turn that I absolutely did not see coming. We've got fake allergies, family drama, Thanksgiving chaos, and wait for it, a TikTok induced mushroom phobia based on The Last of Us. I cannot make this stuff up. Let's get into it. So, our writer starts off by explaining that about 5 years ago, their parents basically retired from hosting Thanksgiving, handed in their turkey baster, and said, "We're done. You kids figure it out." And for the past 3 years, writer has been the one stepping up to host because they've got a big house and actually enjoy cooking, which promise to them, because hosting Thanksgiving is no joke. Ryder handles the main event stuff: turkey, stuffing, mashed potatoes, gravy, and rolls. That's like the entire foundation of Thanksgiving dinner right there. Other family members bring sides, chips, drinks, the supporting cast of the meal. Pretty standard family Thanksgiving setup, nothing weird yet. This year, Ryder's brother and sister-in-law came into town early and stayed over at their place. Already we're setting the stage for prolonged family interaction, which, as we all know, can either be really lovely or a complete disaster. Guess which way this is going to go? Thanksgiving morning, mid-prep, the sister-in-law wanders into the kitchen while Ryder is making stuffing. She sees the pile of ingredients: breadcrumbs, celery, onion, sausage, all the classic stuffing components, and then she sees Ryder sautéing mushrooms. And this is where things start going off the rails. Sister-in-law goes, "What are those for?" in what I'm imagining is a pretty accusatory tone based on the all caps. Ryder tells her they're for the stuffing because, duh, that's what they're making. And then sister-in-law puts her hands on her hips. The universal body language for "I'm about to start some drama," and freaks out saying, "You can't put mushrooms in the stuffing. I'm allergic." Now, Ryder is understandably stupefied. That's the perfect word for it, honestly, because this is the first anyone is hearing about this alleged mushroom allergy, and they've been making the same stuffing for years. So Ryder asks the completely reasonable question: when did this happen? Sister-in-law looks at Ryder like they're an idiot, just straight up gives them the "are you stupid" look. So Ryder clarifies, "When did you discover you're allergic to mushrooms?" Because that's actually a fair question. I don't know. Allergies can develop at any point in life, so if this was a new thing, it would be good to know. But no. Sister-in-law scoffs, and says, "I've always been allergic." Always. As in her entire life, presumably. This woman is claiming she has always had a mushroom allergy. Now, here's where Ryder drops the bomb. When they make stuffing, they like things well incorporated, and they always chop the mushrooms really small after sautéing them. So the mushrooms aren't obvious in the final mix. They just kind of blend in with all the other ingredients. You wouldn't necessarily know there were mushrooms in there just by looking at it. And Ryder just bursts out laughing, which honestly, same. Because the math isn't mathing here. Ryder tells her, "Well, that's interesting because you weren't allergic last year and you weren't allergic the year before." Sister-in-law asks what they mean, probably getting nervous at this point because she can sense where this is going. And Ryder explains that they've been making stuffing exactly like this every single year she's eaten it. And not only has she eaten it with zero allergic reaction, she's raved about it. She's loved it. She's probably asked for seconds, all while eating the very thing she claims to be deathly allergic to. So Ryder concludes, maybe she's not actually allergic. Maybe she just thinks she doesn't like mushrooms and is being dramatic about it, which is a completely logical conclusion to draw from this situation. Sister-in-law gets pissed, shocker, and goes running to Ryder's brother to tattle. She tells him she wants to leave, but brother wants to stay because it's Thanksgiving and presumably he wants to actually eat the meal and spend time with his family. So sister-in-law spends the entire rest of the day just glaring at Ryder, shooting daggers with her eyes, as Ryder so eloquently puts it. The whole day. Can you imagine how uncomfortable that must have been? Just trying to enjoy your Thanksgiving meal while your sister-in-law is practicing her death stare across the table? They were supposed to stay through the weekend, so we're talking multiple more days of this tension. But they left Thanksgiving night instead. Packed up and bounced. The awkwardness won. Ryder confides in their mom and sister about what happened, and they kind of chuckle about it and agree it's not Ryder's fault, because it's not. But then this morning, brother texts Ryder saying that Ryder could have just not used the mushrooms and that they made his wife feel stupid for no reason. Ryder maintains they didn't make her feel anything. She made herself feel stupid by claiming an allergy that clearly doesn't exist and getting called out on it. Which, fair point, honestly. So Ryder asks, am I the asshole? Now, before we get to the judgment, we need to talk about the update because, oh my God, it gets so much better and weirder and more concerning all at the same time. Ryder thanks everyone for their comments, even the people who said they were the asshole, because it gave them stuff to think about. They just got off the phone with their brother and are sitting there with a beer trying to process what they just learned. Already I'm like, oh no, what fresh hell is this? Brother admits that sister-in-law has been eating the stuffing, and also Ryder's sister's green bean casserole, which has also been verified to contain mushrooms, for multiple Thanksgivings now, and did not know there were mushrooms in either dish. So that part of the story is confirmed. She definitely wasn't having allergic reactions because she didn't even know she was eating mushrooms. But here's the kicker. She's never told anyone about any allergies before now. Not her husband, not Ryder's mother, not the sister, not Ryder, nobody. Because, and this is crucial, she doesn't actually have any allergies. So what's going on then? Why the dramatic reaction in the kitchen? Why the hands on hips and the I'm allergic declaration? Apparently, and Ryder is still trying to wrap their head around this, which same, honestly, sister-in-law has some kind of phobia about mushrooms. Not an allergy, a phobia, a fear-based thing. And where did this phobia come from, you might ask? TikTok. It came from TikTok. Specifically, she watched a TikTok video about edible mushrooms growing on dead skin on feet or in human bodies. And now she believes she can be infected by eating mushrooms. I need everyone to really sit with how bonkers this is. She watched a video about mushrooms growing on dead tissue and somehow concluded that eating cooked mushrooms and stuffing could infect her? Like the mushrooms are going to take root in her body and start growing? That's not how any of this works. That's not how mushrooms work. That's not how digestion works. That's not how anything works. Brother tried to assure her it wouldn't happen because he's apparently got at least some grip on reality, but she's gone down the TikTok rabbit hole. She's citing multiple videos she's watched about spores and other mushroom-related content. And then she brings up The Last of Us. For those who don't know, The Last of Us is a video game that was adapted into an HBO show where a fungal infection turns people into zombies. It's fiction. It's horror fiction. It's explicitly not real. Brother even explains to her that it's fiction created from a video game, but sister-in-law swears it's based on fact and is still possible. She thinks The Last of Us is a documentary. She thinks she's going to eat some mushrooms and stuffing and turn into a clicker. I cannot. I absolutely cannot. Um, Ryder very correctly identifies that they have bigger problems than stuffing here. This isn't about whether mushrooms go in the Thanksgiving stuffing. This is about sister-in-law having consumed so much TikTok content that she's lost her ability to distinguish between reality and fiction, between actual science and fear-mongering videos, between a TV show and a documentary. Ryder encourages brother to get her to see a doctor to talk about this, which is probably the most diplomatic way to say, your wife needs professional help that I've ever heard. So now, with all this context, let's talk about whether Ryder is the asshole. The answer is no, absolutely not. Not even a little bit. Ryder is so clearly not the asshole here that it's almost ridiculous we're even discussing it. Let's break this down. At the time of the original incident, Ryder had every reason to believe sister-in-law was either lying about an allergy or genuinely confused about having one. She'd eaten the mushroom stuffing for years with zero reaction and had even loved it. When someone suddenly claims an allergy to something they've been safely consuming, it's completely reasonable to point out that inconsistency. Ryder didn't mock her for having an allergy. Ryder pointed out, with receipts, that she clearly didn't have an allergic reaction to mushrooms in previous years. That's just stating facts. If sister-in-law felt stupid, it's because her claim didn't hold up under the tiniest bit of scrutiny, not because Ryder was being mean. And here's the thing. Ryder couldn't have known about the TikTok mushroom zombie infection fear. That wasn't information anyone had. If sister-in-law had just been honest and said, hey, I know this is weird, but I watched some videos that freaked me out about mushrooms and I'm really uncomfortable eating them now, that would have been a completely different conversation. Weird? Yes, but at least honest. Instead, she lied and said she had an allergy, a medical condition, which is actually kind of a serious thing to lie about. People with real food allergies have to deal with a lot, and claiming a fake allergy diminishes that. Plus, it puts the host in a position where they either have to scramble to change their menu or be seen as inconsiderate of someone's medical needs. Brothers saying Ryder could have just not used the mushrooms is missing the entire point. First of all, Ryder was already mid-preparation when this came up. The mushrooms were already being sautéed. Second, sister-in-law had never mentioned before despite eating the stuffing for years. How was Ryder supposed to know to accommodate a preference that had never been communicated? And let's be real, if sister-in-law has such a strong fear of mushrooms that she can't be in the same room with stuffing that contains them, she needed to communicate that before showing up to Thanksgiving. You can't expect people to read your mind, especially when your mind has been poisoned by TikTok conspiracy theories. The brother is being protective of his wife, which I get. Nobody wants their spouse to feel stupid or embarrassed, but the solution here isn't to blame Ryder for her embarrassment. The solution is for sister-in-law to maybe take a step back from TikTok, talk to an actual medical professional or therapist about this phobia, and learn to communicate her needs like an adult instead of making up medical conditions. Also, can we talk about how sister-in-law handled this? She didn't pull Ryder aside and have a quiet conversation. She didn't say, hey, I know this is last minute, but I've developed this thing about mushrooms. She put her hands on her hips, freaked out, made a scene in the kitchen, claimed a fake allergy, and then when called out on it, went running to her husband to demand they leave. That's not mature adult behavior. That's toddler behavior. And then she spent the entire day glaring at Ryder like Ryder was the one in the wrong here. She couldn't even be civil for the rest of Thanksgiving dinner. She made everyone uncomfortable with her attitude because she got caught in a lie. Look, I have sympathy for phobias. They're real, they're difficult, and they're not always rational. If sister-in-law has genuinely developed a fear of mushrooms due to TikTok brain rot, that sucks for her, and she should get help for it. But that doesn't mean Ryder did anything wrong by pointing out that she's eaten mushrooms before without issue. Ryder made a delicious Thanksgiving meal for their family. They put time and effort into hosting. They've been making the same stuffing recipe for years, and everyone has loved it. They didn't do anything wrong by continuing to make that recipe, and they didn't do anything wrong by pointing out the inconsistency in sister-in-law's sudden allergy claim. If anything, Ryder did her a favor by revealing that she's been eating mushrooms for years without any infection or zombification. Like, her own personal experience should be proof that TikTok lied to her. She's living evidence that eating cooked mushrooms and stuffing does not lead to fungal infections or turning into a Last of Us character. Last of Us character. The fact that brother is texting Ryder to complain instead of getting his wife some help for her very obvious TikTok-induced anxiety is concerning. His wife thinks a TV show is a documentary. She thinks she can be infected by eating normal food. She's so convinced of this that she lied about having an allergy rather than just saying she's uncomfortable eating mushrooms. These are red flags that suggest she might need to talk to someone about her media literacy and her anxiety. Not the asshole. Not even close. Writer, you keep making your delicious mushroom stuffing. You did nothing wrong. You hosted a lovely Thanksgiving. You pointed out a very obvious inconsistency in a reasonable way. The fact that it turned out to be based on TikTok-induced paranoia instead of a simple preference doesn't change anything. And honestly, if your brother wants to be mad at someone, he should be mad at TikTok for convincing his wife that The Last of Us is real. Maybe get her some therapy, limit her screen time, and encourage her to talk to actual doctors instead of getting her medical information from social media. You're good. Your stuffing sounds amazing. Keep doing your thing. And maybe next year, if sister-in-law comes to Thanksgiving, she'll have worked through her mushroom fears with a professional and can enjoy your cooking again without thinking she's going to turn into a zombie. Not the asshole. Case closed. Now, if you'll excuse me, I need to go make sure everyone I know understands that The Last of Us is fiction. Am I the asshole for telling my sister that she shouldn't have sex after she had a hysterectomy? Okay, so we're diving into some spicy family drama that involves religion, hypocrisy, weddings, and the absolute audacity of homophobic relatives. This one's going to hit different because our writer really said, oh, you want to play the Bible logic game? Let's play. Buckle up because this is about to get messy in the best way possible. So, our writer is a woman in a long-term relationship with her fiance, also a woman, and they're getting married later this year. Congratulations to them. They're keeping it small to save money and make it more intimate, which honestly sounds lovely. Small weddings are underrated. You get to actually talk to your guests, and you're not dropping the equivalent of a down payment on a house just to feed people rubber chicken. But here's where things get complicated. Ryder has a sister who is extremely Catholic and has been anti-LGBT since before Ryder even came out. So this isn't like a recent development or a reaction to Ryder's specific relationship. Sister has just been out here being homophobic the whole time. Love that for her. Really great sibling energy there. Ryder has decided not to invite sister to the wedding, which honestly, completely reasonable decision. Why would you invite someone to your wedding who doesn't even think your marriage is real? Like, what's the point? So sister can show up and radiate disapproval the whole time? So she can make passive-aggressive comments during the reception? So she can refuse to congratulate the couple? Hard pass. And here's where we need to talk about the sister's whole situation because it's relevant to the absolute drag that's about to happen. Sister is married and apparently always wanted kids, but she had to get a hysterectomy for medical reasons. That's genuinely unfortunate. I do have sympathy for anyone who wants children but can't have them for medical reasons. That's a real loss and grief that deserves compassion. But, and this is a big but, Sister has been using her religious beliefs as a weapon against Ryder's relationship and future marriage. Specifically, one of her main arguments against LGBT relationships and gay marriage is that they cannot produce life. She thinks marriage is exclusively between a man and a woman who can have sex without contraception with the possibility of making a baby. That's her line in the sand. That's her religious justification for opposing Ryder's marriage. So Ryder asks her a very simple, very pointed question. Does she still have sex with her husband? Now let's just pause here and appreciate the absolute genius of this question. Because if Sister is going to argue that the whole point of marriage and sex is procreation, and that's why gay marriage doesn't count, then by her own logic, she shouldn't be having sex either, since she physically cannot get pregnant. It's applying her exact same standard to her own life. It's holding up a mirror to her hypocrisy. It's chef's kiss, perfect. Sister gets offended, shocking, truly shocking, and says it's not Ryder's business. Which, okay, fair in most contexts. Your sibling's sex life generally isn't your business and asking about it is weird. But Ryder isn't asking because they actually want to know the intimate details of Sister's bedroom activities. Ryder is making a point. And what a point it is. Ryder points out that if sister cannot have a baby due to her hysterectomy, then by her own stated religious beliefs, she should not be having sex with her husband. Because according to sister's own argument, sex is only valid when it can produce a baby. No baby making potential equals no sex allowed. Those are the rules sister herself has established. So Ryder asks, am I the asshole for pointing out her double standards? And look, I'm just going to cut to the chase here because this one is so clear cut, it might as well be a geometry textbook. No. Ryder, you are absolutely not the asshole. Not even a little bit. You're actually kind of my hero for this one. Let's break down why this is such a perfect response to sister's homophobia. Sister has been using a very specific religious argument against Ryder's relationship, that marriage is for procreation. And since two women can't naturally conceive together, their marriage isn't valid. That's her stance. Those are her stated beliefs. But here's the thing about applying rigid religious rules. You don't get to pick and choose when they apply based on what's convenient for you. You don't get to say marriage is only valid if you can make babies and then exempt yourself from that standard when it becomes personally inconvenient. That's not how principles work. That's not how consistency works. That's just hypocrisy with a Bible cover on it. If sister truly believed that sex is only acceptable when it can result in procreation, then she would have to accept that she shouldn't be having sex post-hysterectomy. That's the logical conclusion of her own argument. The fact that she's offended when that standard is applied to her shows that she doesn't actually believe it as a universal principle. She just believes it should apply to other people, specifically to LGBT people whose relationships she wants to invalidate. This is a classic case of someone using religious arguments as a smokescreen for their own prejudice. Because if this was really about deeply held religious convictions about the purpose of marriage, and sister would be applying those standards to herself, she'd be grappling with the theological implications of her own infertility. She might even be in conversation with her priest or religious community about whether her marriage is still valid or whether marital relations are still appropriate. But I'm going to go out on a limb and guess that sister isn't doing any of that. I'm going to guess she hasn't once questioned whether her own marriage counts or whether she should stop having sex with her husband. Because deep down, she knows those arguments are ridiculous when applied to her own life. She knows that her marriage is real and valid regardless of her ability to have children. She knows that intimacy with her spouse serves purposes beyond procreation. She knows all of this when it comes to her own marriage. She just refuses to extend that same logic and compassion to her sister's marriage because she's homophobic and is using religion to justify it. And that's what makes Ryder's response so perfect. It's not cruel. It's not actually invasive, despite sister's protestations. It's just holding up a mirror and saying, apply your own standards to yourself and see how it feels. It's calling out the double standard in a way that's impossible to ignore. Now, some people might say, but Ryder, that was a low blow because you know your sister has medical trauma around her hysterectomy and not being able to have kids. And look, I get that argument. I do have sympathy for sister's loss of fertility if that's something she grieved. But here's the thing. Sister has been actively using religious arguments to invalidate Ryder's entire relationship and upcoming marriage. She's been anti-LGBT since before Ryder even came out. She's been causing harm with these beliefs for years. At some point, you lose the right to clutch your pearls when someone points out that your harmful beliefs would also harm you if you applied them consistently. Sister has been throwing stones from a glass house, and Ryder just pointed out the windows. That's not a low blow. That's accountability. Also, let's talk about the fact that sister apparently thinks Ryder's marriage won't be a real marriage. That's not a small thing to say to your sibling. That's not a minor disagreement. That's telling your sister that one of the most important relationships in her life, the person she's chosen to build a life with, doesn't count. That's telling her that her love is less valid, less real, less worthy than heterosexual love. That's deeply hurtful, and it's been an ongoing thing, not a one-time comment. So Ryder deciding not to invite sister to the wedding, completely justified. Why would you want someone at your wedding who thinks your marriage is fake? What would be the point? So sister can sit there radiating judgment while writer and her fiancé try to celebrate. So sister can make comments about how it's not a real ceremony, so the couple has to worry about whether sister is going to cause a scene or make homophobic remarks to other guests. No thanks. You don't get to spend years being anti-LGBT and against someone's relationship and then act surprised when you're not invited to celebrate that relationship. Actions have consequences. Sister's consequence is not getting to attend the wedding. That's what happens when you don't support someone's marriage. You don't get invited to it. Pretty straightforward cause and effect there. And when sister presumably got upset about not being invited and started in with her religious arguments about why the marriage isn't valid, writer responded by applying sister's own logic to her own life. That's not being an asshole. That's being brilliant. The "it's not your business" response from sister is also kind of rich when you think about it. Sister has made it her business to have opinions about writer's relationship and marriage. She's made it her business to be vocally anti-LGBT. She's made it her business to cite religious reasons why writer's marriage doesn't count. But when writer points out the logical implications of those beliefs for sister's own life, suddenly it's not your business. You can't have it both ways. You can't make your siblings' relationship your business by constantly judging it and opposing it, and then claim privacy when they turn that same scrutiny back on you. That's not how this works. Now, I want to be clear about something. Ryder isn't actually saying that sister shouldn't have sex with her husband. Ryder doesn't actually believe that infertility should disqualify someone from having a sex life or that marriage is only valid if you can have biological children. Ryder is pointing out that sister's arguments against LGBT marriage, when applied consistently, would also invalidate sister's own marriage and sex life. It's a rhetorical device. It's reductio ad absurdum. It's showing sister how ridiculous and harmful her arguments are by applying them to her own situation. And honestly, it's a gentler response than sister probably deserved. Ryder could have gone scorched earth. Ryder could have laid out all the ways sister has been a terrible, unsupportive sibling. Ryder could have detailed every homophobic comment, every eye roll, every passive-aggressive remark over the years. Instead, Ryder chose a surgical strike that went right to the heart of sister's hypocrisy without getting into the emotional weeds. The fact that sister got offended and defensive shows that Ryder hit a nerve. It shows that sister knows on some level that her arguments don't hold up under scrutiny. Because if sister truly believed in the principle she's been citing, that sex is only for procreation, she would have had a response ready. She would have engaged with the theological question. She might have tried to explain some Catholic doctrine about the difference between natural infertility and same-sex couples, which, spoiler alert, is still a homophobic argument, just a more elaborate one. But she didn't do any of that. She just got offended and shut down the conversation because she doesn't actually want to examine her own beliefs or apply them instantly. She wants to use them as a weapon against people she's prejudiced against while exempting herself from any inconvenient implications. And you know what? Ryder doesn't owe it to sister to let that slide. Ryder doesn't have to just accept sister's homophobia in silence to keep the peace. Ryder doesn't have to invite someone to their wedding who doesn't respect their relationship. And Ryder definitely doesn't have to pretend that sister's religious arguments make sense when they clearly fall apart under the slightest examination. Some people might say that family is family, and Ryder should try to maintain the relationship despite sister's beliefs. But here's the thing. Sister is the one who's been damaging the relationship with her homophobia. Sister is the one who thinks Ryder's marriage isn't real. Sister is the one who's been anti-LGBT for years. Ryder has tried to have a relationship with someone who fundamentally doesn't respect a core part of who they are and who they love. At some point, that's not sustainable. And the wedding is a boundary. It's saying, if you can't support this marriage, you don't get to be present for it. That's a reasonable boundary. That's self-protection. That's prioritizing Ryder's own happiness and her fiancé's comfort on what's supposed to be one of the happiest days of their lives. The fact that sister apparently had something to say about not being invited, enough that she started in with her religious arguments and writer felt the need to respond, suggests that sister wanted to have it both ways. She wanted to maintain the relationship and family connection without having to actually change her beliefs or behavior. She wanted to be invited to the wedding despite thinking it's not a real marriage. Or maybe she wanted to play the victim about being excluded while still maintaining her right to judge and oppose the relationship. But that's not how this works. You don't get to be actively homophobic and then complain when there are social consequences for that homophobia. You don't get to tell someone their marriage isn't real and then act hurt when they don't invite you to celebrate it. Ryder's response was perfect because it didn't engage with the emotion of it. It didn't get into, you've hurt me, or you're a bad sister, or any of the personal stuff. It just took sister's stated beliefs and applied them logically to sister's own life. It was clean, it was pointed, and it was devastatingly effective based on how offended sister got. Not the asshole, not even a tiny bit. Ryder, you are so clearly in the right here that it's not even a question. You're getting married to someone you love. You're building a life together. That's beautiful and valid and real, regardless of what your sister thinks. You have every right to protect that day and that celebration from people who don't support it. You have every right to call out hypocrisy when it's being used to attack your relationship. You have every right to point out that sister's arguments against your marriage fall apart when examined closely. Your sister has made her choices. She's chosen her interpretation of religious doctrine over her relationship with you. She's chosen to be vocally anti-LGBT. She's chosen to oppose your marriage. Those are her choices, and she gets to make them, but she doesn't get to make them without consequences. The consequence is that she doesn't get invited to your wedding. The consequence is that when she tries to use religion to justify her homophobia, you get to point out the flaws in that reasoning. The consequence is that your relationship with her is damaged, and that's on her, not you. Go have your beautiful, small, intimate wedding with people who actually love and support you and your fiancé. Celebrate your marriage with people who think it's real and valid and worth celebrating. Live your best life with your wife and don't waste energy on people who can't be happy for you. And if sister ever decides to examine her beliefs, challenge her prejudices, and actually try to have a real relationship with you that includes supporting your marriage, that door can open. But that's her work to do, not yours. You're not the asshole. Your sister is. And honestly, that response about her not being able to have sex post-hysterectomy was chef's kiss. Sometimes the best way to deal with hypocrites is to just hold up a mirror and let them see themselves. Well done. Now, go plan your wedding, marry your person, and live your best queer life. You've got better things to do than worry about whether you were too harsh on someone who thinks your marriage is fake. Not the asshole. Case absolutely closed. Congrats on the upcoming wedding. Am I the asshole for making my mother-in-law uncomfortable and embarrassed during dinner? Okay, so buckle up because we are about to dive into some peak holiday family drama that involves food hoarding, boundary stomping, an uninvited guest, and the absolute audacity of a mother-in-law who apparently thinks Thanksgiving is a free buffet where she can just load up containers like she's meal prepping for the apocalypse. This is going to be good. So, our writer starts off by explaining that they had Thanksgiving today instead of tomorrow because of scheduling conflicts, which honestly is becoming more common. Sometimes you got to do Friendsgiving on a Wednesday or Thanksgiving on a Tuesday because coordinating adult schedules is like herding cats. No judgment there. But here's where it gets interesting. Ryder and her husband agreed ahead of time that he was not going to invite his mom. This wasn't a miscommunication or an oversight. This was a deliberate mutual decision between the couple. And why, you might ask? Oh, let me tell you about the mother-in-law's greatest hits when it comes to food behavior. Apparently, mother-in-law has a pattern, and we're talking a well-established multiple occasions pattern, where she takes food before everyone else gets served. Now, Ryder's household has a system. They feed the kids first. Pretty standard for families with young children, right? Kids eat first, then adults. It's organized, it works, everyone knows the drill. But mother-in-law? She does not care about the system. She jumps the line, serves herself before the kids even get their plates, and then, and this is where it gets wild, she takes off with Tupperware full of their food without even saying goodbye. Just loads up containers and dips out like she's hitting a drive-through. And this has happened multiple times to the point where there wasn't enough food left to go around after she was done hoarding. Ryder explains that mother in law has food insecurities and hoards food, which is acknowledged as a real problem. And look, I want to be clear here. Food insecurity is a serious issue. If mother in law grew up without reliable access to food or has experienced periods of genuine hunger, that absolutely leaves psychological scars. Hoarding food can be a trauma response, and that deserves compassion and understanding. But, and this is a crucial but, Ryder makes an excellent point. It's not her problem and shouldn't be made to be hers either. There's a difference between having compassion for someone's struggles and allowing them to repeatedly create problems in your home that directly affect you and your children. You can acknowledge that someone has issues while still setting boundaries around how those issues impact you. And the impact here is significant. Ryder mentions that she's usually the one going hungry because she's always last to eat in a family of 6 with 4 kids. She serves her kids, then her husband, then herself. So by the time everyone's been fed and mother-in-law has loaded up her plate and her takeout containers, there's often not enough left for Ryder to eat. At her own Thanksgiving dinner that she presumably spent hours cooking, let that sink in. So the decision not to invite mother-in-law to this Thanksgiving was a boundary that Ryder and her husband set together. They were trying to avoid the exact scenario that has played out multiple times before. Reasonable, right? But plot twist. But mother-in-law caught wind somehow and showed up anyway. She wasn't invited. She somehow found out about the dinner, and I have questions about how that happened, but that's a whole other issue, and just showed up. That's already bold as hell. Showing up to an event you weren't invited to is peak boundary stomping behavior. Neither Ryder nor her husband said anything because they didn't want to cause an issue. They didn't kick her out. Now, some people might say, well, there's your mistake. You should have turned her away at the door. And maybe that's true. But I also understand the instinct to avoid confrontation, like especially on a holiday when you've got a house full of people and just want things to go smoothly. So they let her stay. Mistake or not, that was their choice in the moment. When dinner was done, Ryder called the kids over with kids, food. Simple, straightforward, same system they always use. And what does mother-in-law do? She immediately jumps up from the couch to get to the front of the line and starts trying to dig in before the children can get their food. Let me repeat that. A grown adult woman jumped up to cut in front of children, including her own grandchildren, presumably, to get food first at someone else's house, at a dinner she wasn't even invited to. The audacity is absolutely breathtaking. So Ryder says, I'm sorry, but are you a child? No? Go sit down and wait your turn. And honestly, perfect response. Slightly sarcastic, completely justified, and gets the point across. If you're going to act like a child cutting in line, you're going to get treated like a child cutting in line and told to wait your turn. Mother-in-law's face goes bright red. Shocker. People don't like being called out on their bad behavior. And she goes back to the couch and crosses her arms, mumbling under her breath. The crossed arms and mumbling is such childish behavior that it actually proves Ryder's point about her acting like a kid. This is a grown woman literally pouting on the couch because she got told to wait her turn to eat. When Ryder calls the adults to come get food, mother-in-law stays planted on the couch and says something like, "Are you sure there's even enough for me?" in what Ryder describes as a childish tone. This is passive-aggressive behavior 101. She's trying to make everyone feel bad, trying to create guilt, trying to be the victim. Oh, poor me. I guess there won't be enough for me. I'll just starve, I guess. Come on. Ryder chooses not to react and just ignores it, which is honestly the right move. Don't feed into passive-aggressive behavior. Don't take the bait. Let it sit there. Mother-in-law eventually comes up later, grabs food, and wolfs it down her throat, which paints quite the picture of someone eating frantically, probably because of those food insecurities Ryder mentioned. And then Right on schedule like clockwork, she goes to their cupboard for Tupperware. Ryder asks what she thinks she's doing, and mother-in-law says, "Well, Tom is at home. Figured I'd grab him a plate." Tom, her boyfriend that none of them have met. So not only is she trying to take leftovers from a dinner she wasn't invited to, she's trying to take food for a whole other person who definitely wasn't invited and who the family doesn't even know. The entitlement here is absolutely staggering. She's in someone else's home at a dinner she crashed, and she thinks she's entitled to take food home for her boyfriend. What parallel universe is this woman living in where that's appropriate behavior? Ryder tells her that her boyfriend is not their problem and she is not taking their leftovers to feed him. Completely reasonable boundary. Mother-in-law then asks if she can take a plate for herself. Notice the switch in strategy when the first attempt didn't work. So Ryder says, sure, compromise, right? Except then we get to the Tupperware situation. Mother-in-law had grabbed one of their oversized containers. You know the ones. The big family-size containers meant for storing like an entire casserole or a week's worth of meal prep. Ryder swaps it out for a normal-size container that would hold roughly 2 cans of soup. That's still a decent amount of food. That's a reasonable portion for one person to take home, but mother-in-law asks if Ryder is serious. She's offended by the smaller container. She wants the giant one so she can take half the leftovers home with her. Ryder says, dead serious, and walks off. Mother-in-law throws the Tupperware in the sink and walks out without saying anything. The throwing the container in the sink is such a tantrum move. She didn't get her way, so she's going to make a small aggressive gesture on her way out. Very mature. Really showing that she's not acting like a child at all. But wait, the drama doesn't end there. Mother-in-law calls Ryder's husband later and gives him an earful about feeling unwelcome during the holidays. Which, I mean, you were unwelcome. You literally weren't invited. You showed up anyway. The fact that you felt unwelcome is both accurate and entirely your own doing. She says Ryder was acting both immature and high and mighty and embarrassed her in front of everyone. Now let's unpack this. There were roughly 12 adults and 10 kids there, so a full house of witnesses. Mother-in-law is claiming she was embarrassed in front of all these people. But here's the thing. She embarrassed herself. She embarrassed herself by trying to cut in front of children to get food first. She embarrassed herself by pouting on the couch. She embarrassed herself by trying to take a massive container of leftovers from a dinner she wasn't invited to. Ryder just enforced basic boundaries and household rules. If mother-in-law felt embarrassed, that's because her behavior was embarrassing, not because Ryder did anything wrong. Mother-in-law demands that Ryder apologize. She was on speaker, which I love because it means Ryder could hear everything and respond directly. Ryder calmly, and I want to emphasize calmly because that takes restraint, says she will not apologize for making mother-in-law follow the same rules as everyone else. Perhaps her own entitlement to other people's food is the real issue here. Boom. Perfect response. Not emotional, not mean, just stating facts. Everyone else follows the rules. Kids eat first, adults eat second. You can take a reasonable portion of leftovers if offered. Mother-in-law doesn't get special exemption from those rules just because she has food insecurities or because she's family. Then Ryder drops the financial bomb. They didn't spend $1,000 on Thanksgiving dinner, which honestly sounds about right for a gathering of 22 people, for mother-in-law to take $200 of it home with her. That really puts it in perspective, doesn't it? When you frame it as you're trying to take 20% of the food budget we spent, it becomes crystal clear how unreasonable the ask is. Ryder tells her she needs to take a step back and assess her behavior. Mother-in-law hangs up. Can't handle the truth, so she just ends the conversation. Classic. But now, and this is where it gets tricky, Ryder's husband is giving her the cold shoulder. He's gone radio silent, says he doesn't want to talk about it, and is apparently mad at Ryder, even though they agreed beforehand not to invite his mother for exactly these reasons. So let's break this down and get to the judgment, because there's a lot to unpack here. Is Ryder the asshole? No, absolutely not. Not even a little bit. Ryder is so clearly not the asshole here that I'm actually baffled there's even a question. Let's look at the facts. Ryder and husband agreed not to invite mother-in-law because of her established pattern of problematic behavior around food. Mother-in-law showed up anyway without an invitation. That's already crossing a boundary. Mother-in-law tried to cut in front of the children to get food first, violating the household's established feeding order. When corrected, mother-in-law acted like a child, pouting, crossing arms, making passive-aggressive comments. Mother-in-law tried to take a massive amount of leftovers, including food for someone who wasn't even there. When given a reasonable-sized container for leftovers, mother-in-law threw a fit. At every single step of this story, Ryder set and enforced reasonable boundaries. Feed the kids first. Wait your turn. You can take a reasonable portion of leftovers for yourself, not half the food, including portions for people who weren't even here. These aren't mean boundaries. These aren't petty boundaries. These are basic functioning in society boundaries. These are how to be a respectful guest in someone's home boundaries. The fact that mother-in-law has food insecurities doesn't give her a free pass to violate those boundaries. And I say this with genuine compassion for anyone struggling with food insecurity. Having trauma around food doesn't mean you get to take food from children. It doesn't mean you get to show up uninvited and raid someone's leftovers. It doesn't mean you get to make your issues everyone else's problem to solve. If mother-in-law is struggling with food insecurity to the point where she's hoarding food and acting this way, she needs professional help. She needs therapy to address the trauma. She might need to connect with food banks or assistance programs. What she doesn't need is to be enabled in taking food from her own grandchildren and creating conflict at family gatherings. Ryder was not immature. Immature is throwing a Tupperware container in the sink because you didn't get your way. Immature is pouting on the couch. Immature is trying to sneak to the front of the line before children can eat. Ryder was calm, direct, and consistent in enforcing boundaries. Ryder was not high and mighty. High and mighty would be rubbing it in mother-in-law's face, making her beg for food, or publicly shaming her. Ryder simply enforced the rules that everyone else was already following. That's not being superior. That's being fair. As for the embarrassment, yes, mother-in-law was probably embarrassed, but she was embarrassed because she got called out for inappropriate behavior in front of people. That's a natural consequence of acting inappropriately in a group setting. If you don't want to be corrected in front of people, don't misbehave in front of people. Pretty simple. Now let's talk about the husband situation, because this is actually the bigger problem. Husband agreed not to invite his mother. He presumably knew why. He's experienced this pattern of behavior before. He knows it usually results in Ryder not getting enough to eat at her own dinner. He was on board with the boundary. But now that the boundary has been enforced and his mother is upset, he's giving Ryder the cold shoulder. That's not okay. That's not being a supportive partner. That's prioritizing his mom's feelings over his wife's very reasonable boundaries and over the well-being of his own children, who mother-in-law tried to cut in front of, remember. This is a classic case of someone being willing to set a boundary, but not willing to enforce it or deal with the fallout. It's easy to say, yeah, we won't invite her when it's hypothetical. It's harder to deal with the angry phone calls and guilt trips afterward. But that's part of having boundaries. If you're not willing to weather the storm that comes from enforcing them, then they're not really boundaries at all. Husband needs to get his priorities straight. His mother crashed a dinner she wasn't invited to, tried to take food before his children could eat, tried to steal a massive amount of leftovers, and is now demanding an apology from his wife who did nothing wrong. And his response is to give his wife the silent treatment, make that make sense. This is the kind of dynamic that needs to be addressed, because if husband can't stand up to his mother and support his wife when she's enforcing completely reasonable boundaries, this problem is going to keep happening. Mother-in-law will keep stomping boundaries because she knows there won't be real consequences. She'll get her feelings hurt. Husband will get mad at wife instead of addressing his mother's behavior, and nothing will change. Ryder needs to have a serious conversation with her husband when he's ready to talk again. Something like, "We agreed together not to invite your mother because of her pattern of behavior around food. She showed up anyway and did exactly what we knew she would do. Tried to take food before the kids, and tried to leave with excessive leftovers. I enforced the same rules everyone else follows. Why are you mad at me instead of addressing your mother's behavior? Why is it okay for me to go hungry at my own Thanksgiving dinner so your mother can hoard food? We need to be on the same team here, because that's what this comes down to. Are they a team or not? If they're a team, husband needs to support wife's very reasonable boundaries with his mother. If he can't do that, they've got a bigger problem than Tupperware containers. Some people might say Ryder should have just let mother-in-law take the big container to keep the peace. But you know what? No. Keeping the peace by constantly giving in to unreasonable demands isn't keeping peace, it's enabling dysfunction. It's teaching mother-in-law that if she throws a big enough fit, she'll get what she wants. It's prioritizing avoiding conflict over actually solving the problem. And what kind of message does that send to the kids? Grandma gets to cut in line and take all the leftovers because she throws tantrums and we're scared to say no to her. That's not a good lesson. Kids need to see adults enforcing fair rules and boundaries, even when it's uncomfortable. Ryder spent $1,000 on Thanksgiving dinner for 22 people. She cooked, she hosted, she organized feeding everyone in an orderly way that prioritized the children. She has every right to control how much food leaves her house and who gets to take it. The fact that she was still willing to let mother-in-law take a reasonable portion home shows she's not being stingy or mean. She just doesn't want half her leftovers walking out the door. And let's be real, those leftovers were probably meant to feed Ryder's own family for the next few days. A lot of people do Thanksgiving specifically because it creates leftovers that can be meals for the rest of the week. Ryder has 4 kids to feed. She needs those leftovers more than mother-in-law needs to hoard them. Not the asshole. Ryder, you did everything right. You set clear boundaries. You enforced them calmly and consistently. You didn't yell. You didn't make a huge scene. You just redirected behavior that was out of line. The fact that mother-in-law is upset is her problem, not yours. You don't owe her an apology. You owe her nothing except the same respect and boundaries you'd give to any other adult who shows up uninvited and tries to raid your fridge. Actually, you gave her more than that by still allowing her to stay and eat and take a reasonable portion home. Your husband needs to get his head on straight and remember who he's married to and who he's building a life with. His mother's food issues are sad, but they're not your emergency to manage, especially not at the expense of feeding your own children and yourself. Stand your ground. Don't apologize. Have a firm conversation with your husband about being a united front. And maybe next holiday, if mother-in-law isn't invited, change the locks or at least be prepared to actually turn her away at the door if she shows up again. Not the asshole. Not even close. You're a host who enforced reasonable boundaries with a guest who was behaving inappropriately. That's it. That's the whole story. Anyone who says otherwise is wrong. Am I the asshole for telling my mother-in-law we are never moving to Virginia? All right, folks, strap in because we're about to unpack some classic mother-in-law overstepping boundary drama mixed with a healthy dose of your adult child made their choice a decade ago, but you refuse to accept it. This one hits different because it involves a baby on the way, geography wars, and a mother-in-law who apparently thinks 10 years of respecting a decision is enough time served, and now it's her turn. Let's dive in. So our writer is from Queens, New York. Shout out to Queens. And her husband is from Virginia. They met in college, which is already setting up that classic scenario where 2 people from different places have to figure out where they're going to build their life together. This is like a tale as old as time for college couples. You meet someone great, you fall in love, and then graduation hits and suddenly you're faced with, okay, but where are we actually going to live though? When they graduated and were making those big life decisions about their future, Ryder made something crystal clear from the jump. She was living in New York. Her life is there. That's where she wants to be for her entire life. And if husband wanted to move back to Virginia, they should just end the relationship right then and there. Now, that might sound harsh to some people, but honestly, that's actually really mature and healthy communication. She's not stringing him along, she's not being wishy-washy, she's laying out her non-negotiables up front so he can make an informed decision about whether this relationship is gonna work for him. Um, and guess what? Husband said he wanted to live in New York too. So they moved to Queens and been there for almost 10 years. A decade, 10 whole years. That's not a trial period. That's not let's see how this goes. That's a full established life. They've been building their life in New York for longer than some marriages last. But here's where the mother-in-law enters the chat. She was not happy about this decision. Shocker. And according to Ryder, has never gotten over it. But to her credit, she has mostly kept her mouth shut about it. Until now. Flash forward to present day. Ryder is pregnant with their first baby, a boy, and they go to visit husband's family in Virginia for Thanksgiving. And apparently, mother-in-law decided that Thanksgiving was the perfect time to launch her campaign to get them to move to Virginia. Nothing says grateful holiday celebration like passive-aggressive comments about geography, right? The entire visit, mother-in-law keeps making comments about how sad she is that she won't be able to see her grandson grow up, which, okay, I get that grandparents want to be close to their grandkids. That's totally normal. But the phrasing of won't be able to see him grow up is so dramatic. Like they live in Virginia, not Antarctica. New York to Virginia is not an impossible distance. People visit, there's technology, FaceTime exists. Acting like she'll never see this child is manipulative emotional language designed to create guilt. She also keeps going on about how there's so much more family in Virginia and how Ryder's family is so small. Ryder provides context here. Yes, her family is small. It's just her mom, her cousin, the cousin's two kids, and an aunt and uncle. But here's the important part. They are extremely close and see each other multiple times a week. Multiple times a week. That's not a small family in terms of connection and support. That's just a smaller number of people. And honestly, can we talk about how rude it is to disparage someone's family size? Like, what is Ryder supposed to do about that? Conjure up more relatives. The implication that a smaller family is somehow inferior or insufficient is really condescending. Quality over quantity, mother-in-law. A tight-knit group of 6 people who see each other multiple times a week is worth way more than a huge extended family you only see at holidays. Ryder and husband ignore the comments at first, which is probably the strategy most of us would take. Don't engage, don't feed into it, just let it roll off and hopefully she'll get the hint and drop it. But she doesn't drop it. She keeps going. Finally, and this is where mother-in-law really shows her whole hand. She says outright that it's only fair that they moved to Virginia now since they lived in New York for Ryder for 10 years. Okay, pause. Let's unpack this fairness argument because it's complete nonsense. First of all, they didn't live in New York for Ryder for 10 years. They lived in New York because both of them wanted to live there. Husband agreed to it. He chose it. He's been living there happily for a decade. This isn't some situation where Ryder dragged him kicking and screaming to New York and he's been miserable the whole time, counting down the days until they move back to Virginia. Second, this isn't a timeshare. You don't take turns living in different states like you're splitting custody of your marriage. Well, we did 10 years in New York. Now we owe you 10 years in Virginia. Then maybe we'll try Montana for a bit. That's not how building a life works. You choose a place, you put down roots, you build careers and friendships and community, and you don't just uproot all of that because someone decided it's their turn now. The entitlement of framing this as a fairness issue is actually wild. What's fair is that her adult son got to choose where he wanted to live, and he chose New York. That was his choice to make, and he made it a decade ago. But mother-in-law isn't done with her pitch. She's got a whole list of reasons prepared for why they should move to Virginia. The baby would have so many cousins, aunts, and uncles. Their village would be stronger there. Virginia is safer. They could afford a big house with a yard. And here's the kicker. She's retired, so she could watch the baby all the time. Now let's address these points one by one, because they range from that's a valid consideration to that's actually a reason not to move. The cousins and extended family thing, sure, that would be nice for the kid. Having lots of family around can be great. But you know what else is great? Having parents who are happy and fulfilled in where they live. Having a tight-knit, close relationship with the family that is around, even if there's fewer of them. Kids don't need dozens of relatives to have a good childhood. They need present, engaged family members. Quality over quantity strikes again. The village would be stronger there argument is debatable. Ryder already has a village in New York, her close family that she sees multiple times a week, plus presumably friends and community they've built over 10 years of living there. A village isn't just blood relatives, it's the network of support you build, and they've had 10 years to build that in New York. Virginia is safer. I mean, okay, that's a whole debate we could get into about urban versus suburban living and crime statistics, but also people raise kids in cities all the time and they turn out fine. This feels like a dig at New York more than a genuine safety concern. You could afford a big house with a yard. This is actually the most legitimate practical point. Um, Cost of living in Queens versus Virginia dramatically different, no question. You could definitely get more house for your money in Virginia. But here's the thing. Housing isn't everything. If it was just about having the biggest house, everyone would move to the middle of nowhere where house dirt cheap. People choose to live in expensive cities because of career opportunities, culture, community, lifestyle, and yes, proximity to family that matters to them. And finally, I'm retired, so I could watch the baby all the time. Now, for some people, this would be a huge perk. Free childcare from grandma. But I'm getting the vibe that for Ryder, this is actually not a selling point. Based on mother-in-law's behavior, the guilt trips, the boundary pushing, the refusal to respect their decision, I'm guessing Ryder is not jumping at the chance to have this woman as the primary caregiver for her child. Also, watch the baby all the time has some controlling undertones to it. Not, I'd love to help out when you need it, or I could babysit sometimes, but all the time. That sounds less like offering support and more like planning to be overly involved in raising this child. So after listening to this whole pitch, Ryder has had enough. She tells mother-in-law flat out, we are never moving to Virginia, like our lives are in New York. And there's zero chance that's changing. No ambiguity, no we'll think about it, no maybe someday. Just a clear direct boundary. And here's what's important. Husband agrees immediately. He doesn't hesitate, he doesn't look uncomfortable, he doesn't try to play both sides. He says he's lived in both places and he genuinely prefers New York. This isn't Ryder forcing him to stay somewhere he doesn't want to be. This is both partners being aligned on where they want to raise their family. Mother-in-law shuts up after that. Mission accomplished, right? But then sister-in-law pipes up and tells Ryder she was too harsh and she could at least consider it and listen to what mother-in-law had to say. Okay, sister-in-law, several problems with this take. First, Ryder did listen to what mother-in-law had to say. She listened to days of passive-aggressive comments. She listened to the whole pitch about cousins and safety and houses and free babysitting. She listened. She just didn't agree. Listening doesn't mean you have to be convinced or change your mind. Second, what exactly was harsh about Ryder's response? She stated a fact. They're not moving to Virginia. She didn't insult mother-in-law, didn't call her names, didn't tell her to mind her own business, though she would have been justified. She just set a clear boundary after mother-in-law had spent the entire visit pushing and pushing. Third, consider it. Consider what? Uprooting their entire lives, leaving the city they love, the family they're close to, the careers and community they've built over 10 years because mother-in-law decided now that there's a baby involved, she gets to override the decision that was made a decade ago? What is there to consider? So let's get to the judgment because this one is pretty straightforward. Is Ryder the asshole? No, absolutely not. Not even a tiny bit. Ryder is so clearly not the asshole here that I'm actually surprised sister-in-law had the audacity to say she was harsh. Let's look at the facts. 10 years ago, before the relationship got serious, Ryder was upfront about wanting to live in New York for her entire life. This was communicated clearly before they made long-term commitments. Husband agreed and said he wanted to live in New York too. This was his choice, freely made. They've built a life in New York for a decade. They have careers, community, and family there. Mother-in-law has been unhappy about this the entire time, but mostly kept quiet until now. The pregnancy seems to have activated mother-in-law's belief that she now gets a say in where they live. After days of passive-aggressive comments and guilt trips, mother-in-law directly stated they should move to Virginia and presented it as a fairness issue. Ryder set a clear boundary after listening to all of this. Where in this timeline is Ryder the asshole? She communicated her needs up front. She didn't trick her husband or drag him somewhere against his will. She built a life in the place they both agreed to live. She tolerated days of inappropriate comments before finally setting a firm boundary. And when she did set that boundary, she did it clearly, but not cruelly. The real issue here is that mother-in-law never actually accepted her son's decision to live in New York. She just bided her time, waiting for an opportunity to try to change it. And she thought a baby would be that opportunity. She thought the leverage of, "Don't you want your son to know his grandmother?" and "Think of all the family he'd have here," would be enough to override a decade of established life choices. But that's not how this works. Having a baby doesn't mean you owe your in-laws proximity. It doesn't mean you have to reorganize your entire life around making it convenient for grandparents to be involved. Of course, it's nice when grandparents can be nearby and involved, but that's a bonus, not a requirement, and definitely not something you uproot your life for if it doesn't align with what you want. Ryder has a close family in New York that she sees multiple times a week. That baby is going to have grandma, young cousins to grow up with, and an aunt and uncle all nearby and very involved. That's not nothing. That's actually a really lovely support system. The fact that there's more relatives in Virginia doesn't negate the family support that exists in New York. And let's talk about the fairness argument again, because it really bugs me. Mother-in-law framed this as, "You lived in New York for Ryder for 10 years. Now it's only fair to move to Virginia." But that's a completely false premise. They didn't live in New York for Ryder. They lived in New York because that's where they both wanted to be. If husband had been miserable in New York for 10 years and sacrificing his happiness for Ryder, then sure, maybe there would be a conversation to be had about compromise and what's fair. But that's not the case. Husband immediately backed Ryder up and said he's lived in both places and prefers New York. He's not sacrificing anything. He's living where he wants to live. So the fairness argument is really just mother-in-law trying to reframe her son's autonomous choice as something he did for his wife that he now deserves credit or compensation for. It's minimizing his agency and his preferences to make it seem like he's owed something. And you know what? Even if husband was on the fence or considering Virginia, Ryder would still not be the asshole for clearly stating her position. She was upfront about this 10 years ago. She didn't hide the ball. She told him from the beginning that New York was non-negotiable for her. If that was going to be a problem, he had a full decade to bring it up. You don't get to agree to something for 10 years and then act like it's unfair that the other person expects you to stick to the agreement. The sister-in-law saying Ryder should at least consider it is also frustrating because it implies that Ryder hasn't thought about where she wants to live and raise her family. Like she just randomly picked New York on a whim and has never examined that choice. Ryder has clearly thought about this. She's thought about it enough to make it a deal breaker in her relationship from the very beginning. She's lived there for her entire life, presumably. She knows what she wants, and she's built her life accordingly. Considering something doesn't mean you have to change your mind about it. Ryder can consider mother-in-law's points about extended family and cost of living and yard space and still conclude that none of that outweighs the value of living in the place she loves, near the family she's close to, in the community she's built. That's not being closed-minded. That's knowing what your priorities are. Also, can we acknowledge how inappropriate it is for mother-in-law to even be pushing this? Her son is a grown man who made a choice about where to live a decade ago. He's been happy with that choice. He's building a family there, and she's trying to guilt trip and manipulate him into moving closer to her because she's sad she won't see the baby as much as she wants. It's entirely about her feelings and her wants, with no consideration for what's actually best for her son's family. Whole "I'm retired so I could watch the baby all the time" thing is particularly telling. That's not really about helping them out. That's about mother-in-law wanting access and involvement and probably some level of control. If this was really about supporting the new parents, she'd be offering to visit New York regularly, or to pay for them to visit Virginia, or to help out in ways that respect where they've chosen to live. Instead, she's using it as a bargaining chip. "Move here and you'll get free childcare" is just another form of "you should reorganize your life around my preferences." And the fact that she couldn't even wait until after Thanksgiving dinner to start this campaign is kind of wild. They came to visit for the holiday, and she immediately started in with the guilt trips and manipulation. She couldn't just enjoy the visit and the time with her son and pregnant daughter-in-law. She had to make it about her agenda. Ryder was not harsh. Ryder was clear. There's a difference. Harsh would be, um, "Your opinion doesn't matter, and we don't care about your feelings." What Ryder said was, "We are not moving to Virginia. Our lives are in New York, and that's not changing." That's just stating a boundary. It's direct, yes, but it needed to be direct because mother-in-law clearly wasn't getting the hint from the gentle deflection of her earlier comments. When someone is pushing a boundary repeatedly, sometimes you have to state it firmly and unambiguously, so there's no room for misinterpretation or continued pushing. That's not being mean, that's being clear. If mother-in-law's feelings were hurt, it's because she didn't like the answer, not because the answer was delivered cruelly. Ryder is not the asshole. Mother-in-law is the asshole for spending 10 years resenting her son's life choices and then trying to use a pregnancy as leverage to override those choices. Sister-in-law is a bit of an asshole for siding with mother-in-law and suggesting that Ryder should consider fundamentally changing her life to appease her mother-in-law's wants. The only thing Ryder could maybe have done differently is having this conversation in private rather than in the moment with everyone around. But honestly, mother-in-law was making these comments publicly throughout the visit, so addressing them publicly seems fair. Not the asshole. Stand your ground, Ryder. You were clear about your life plans from day one. You and your husband are aligned on where you want to live and raise your family. You have family support in New York. You've built a life there. You don't owe it to your mother-in-law to abandon all of that because she's decided it's her turn now. Have your baby in New York. Raise your son in the city you love, near the family you're close to, in the community you've built. Visit Virginia when it works for you. FaceTime regularly. Send pictures. Be gracious about maintaining the relationship with extended family in Virginia. But do not uproot your entire life because your mother-in-law thinks she's entitled to proximity to her grandchild. Not the asshole, not even close. Your life, your choice. End of story.